Once again, welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures' daily dose of nature. Sloth bears, sun bears, and polar bears, an unlikely trio, with expedition leaders Annie and Dinther and Aditya Panda. Thank you both for being here today. Annie, I'll turn it over to you to get us going.
Great, thanks Colby. Appreciate you getting us set up there, and thanks to all of you who've signed in. We're super excited about this kind of odd topic today. It's one that is rooted in both Aditya and I's curiosity about bears from other places. So Aditya, thank you so much for joining us. How about you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Annie. Thanks, Colby. Hello, everyone. My name is Aditya Panda, and I am Nat Hab's India expedition leader. I lead both the India trips, the Grand India Wildlife Adventure and India Tiger Quest, and I've been leading with Nat Hab since 2016. Now, on both these trips that we have in India, one animal that we always look forward to seeing is the sloth bear. We don't see them as often as we'd like to. I joke with my guests that for every 20 tigers that you see, you probably see a leopard, and every 5 leopards that you see, you probably see a sloth bear. But we do get lucky with them, and every season we have a few very good sightings. And I'm very excited to talk about this very interesting Baloo from the Jungle Book.
All right, so let's get going. In order to talk about sloth bears and polar bears, we have to take a journey back in time. We've got to talk about the evolution of the bears. I do have Chicago roots, so got to do a mention to that. Really, when we look at the bear family, the Ursus family, we're looking at animals that evolved from a dog-like creature into what we think of as a bear. And then we also see evolution from those early bears to other bears. Now, Aditya found this awesome chart that explains all these different bears of the world. I mean, how different can you be from a panda to a polar bear, an all bamboo diet, to going for seals? And then, of course, who we're going to focus on today. Let's look at just how long it took for us to come up with these bears. Tell us a little bit about this graph, Aditya.
Yeah, so Annie, this shows the evolution of bears from the earliest common ancestor that appeared about 30 million years ago, not too long ago. And this was an ancestral small mammal family from which the modern bears, small bears, and canids evolved. So our dogs do have common ancestry with bears. And the Ursinus, which are the ancestors of the Ursidae, which is the real bears, can be traced back to a small sheepdog-sized animal of canid origins. And this family Ursidae then evolved into the 8 known modern species of true bears, all of which have very similar characteristics. They're all robustly built. They all are omnivores, and in most of their cases, they're primarily vegetarian, but also feeding on opportunistic meals of meat. And if we can go to the next slide. That's a very interesting thing that if you noticed in the previous slide, the polar bear and the brown bear are actually placed quite close to each other in the evolutionary chart. And it is believed that polar bears have their origins in brown bears.
That's right. And something, Aditya, that comes up quite a bit in, I would say, news sources is this hybridization idea. There's a lot of talk about whether or not polar bears and brown bears are going to hybridize, especially. It's especially talked about as if it's like the polar bear's response to climate change is to almost go back in the evolutionary direction it came from. And while there are a lot of different news articles about it, and there's all this surmising. We do know that it's not actually nearly as common as those articles would make us to believe. In fact, it's really just one family lineage from northern Canada that has kind of caused all this hubbub. So the hybrids that we know of currently today all came from one female polar bear that mated with a male grizzly, and her children's children, right? They were all sort of taught this behavior, and so it continues. But it is isolated to this one specific area. It is not sort of this, at least not that we know of, it is not this sort of circumpolar behavior that articles might make us think it is. I will say the reason people think that is because polar bears are being put back into the territory where we can find grizzlies and brown bears. So, you know, instead of hanging out on the ice all winter long, like we would maybe expect, and then even through the summer, they are going to be forced onto land, and those territories would overlap. So it makes sense that we would sort of jump to that conclusion. Tell me, this is something that has come a little bit close to home. Tell me of this.
Well, so like you have the legend of the Bigfoot or Sasquatch in the United States, we have in the Himalaya, across the Himalaya, in fact, in Tibet, Bhutan, India, Nepal, the legend of the Yeti. And the Yeti, or the abominable snowman, is something that a lot of people seriously believe in. And over the years, a lot of evidence has been presented. Let me say evidence within quotes, like these huge human-like footprints that you see, and also a lot of so-called tissue. So somebody claims to have a Yeti scalp, somebody has skin, somebody has hair. And a lot of these, of course, you know, after DNA identification became possible, have been tested. And most of them have turned out to be either domestic goats or typically the Himalayan brown bear or black bear. But in 2013, there was a very interesting case where unidentified hair samples, both from Ladakh in India and also from Bhutan, actually matched, you know, the DNA matched with a sample of ancient polar bear jawbone that was found in Norway. That must have been, you know, it's estimated to be between 40,000 to 120,000 years old, which raises a lot of questions about, you know, the possible existence of some ancestral polar bear and Himalayan brown bear hybrids of sort, you know, which might have been the reason behind the legend of the Yeti. You know, it's not for nothing that the Himalaya are called the third pole, and you know, that's a mystery that's very, very interesting.
So it sounds to me like what you're saying is you and I need to find a grant so that we can go hike around that area and find out what's really going on. Sound good?
Absolutely.
Good. Anyone out there want to, you know, go for that? We'll do it. So let's focus in now on the sloth bear. I am absolutely fascinated with this bear, and I know that you feel the same about the polar bear. So let's teach each other for a bit here about these different animals. Tell us about the sloth bear.
Well, the sloth bear is the most widespread bear found in the Indian subcontinent. In fact, it is endemic to the Indian subcontinent. It's found only in India, mainland India, of course, parts of Nepal and parts of Sri Lanka. It's not found anywhere, you know, further east of Northeast India. It does not extend into Southeast Asia like a lot of other Indian species do. It's a medium-sized bear. Certainly, anything compared to a polar bear is either medium or small. They grow to be about 2 to 2.5, 3 feet high at the shoulder, and their length can range between 55 to say about 74, 75 inches. The males, of course, like in all bears, are larger than the females and can weigh between 160 to 400 pounds, while the females usually range between 120 to 240 pounds. So that sort of puts them in the weight range, say between a little heavier than leopards, but a lot less heavy than tigers. They have a gestation period of about 6 to 7 months, and they have, captive animals' lifespan has been noted to be as long as 40 years. They were once very widespread across India, and their range has decreased drastically, but they're classed as vulnerable, as wherever they're found, they're still locally considered common. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that these sloth bears actually are found across a range of habitats, from moist and dry deciduous tropical forests to a lot of rocky, hilly parts, especially in peninsular India. We have what is called the Deccan Plateau, which is primarily a very rocky, very sparsely vegetated kind of landscape, which sloth bears love. And this photograph here is from that area. They find excellent hiding places, dens in these rocky outcrops, and there's plenty for them to eat there. So tell me about the, sorry, Annie.
Well, I understand you've got the sloth bear, right? And it's really cool to learn about them and their size. And it's interesting to me that the captivity lifespan is similar for both the polar bear and the sloth bear. But there's more bears in India. And so tell us quickly about especially the sun bear and then the black and brown bear, which I think sometimes we forget that those are in India. We think of them very much so as a North American sort of an icon. I think America has sort of taken on that bear as, you know, the icon. So yeah, tell us about these bears of India.
Sure. So the sun bear has the western extremities of its range in the northeastern part of India. It's not very common anymore, and most detections are from camera traps and very rare sightings from certain areas of Northeast India. Yeah, thanks for pointing that on the map, Annie. And as you can see in the map, there are very few isolated spots from which we find sun bears now. And the sun bear probably deserves a webinar to itself, given how interesting it is and how endangered it is. The other two bears, the brown bear and the black bear, are actually quite widespread across the northern hemisphere. So the Himalayan brown bear and the Asiatic black bear are both subspecies of the brown bear and black bear that you have in America. So they're the same species. But if you can point on the map, Annie, the brown bear range in India is mostly in the Himalayan, the Greater Himalayan and the Trans-Himalayan regions, where temperatures are very similar to what you must be having in Alaska and the polar bear areas of the Arctic part of the world. The Himalayan brown bear is slightly smaller than the American grizzly. The Asiatic black bear, though, is found in two different populations, which again are two different subspecies in India. There's one that coincides with the Himalayan brown bear population, and the Himalayan black bear is also found in lower altitudes than the Himalayan brown bear in the northern part of India. And in northeastern India, we have another population which is found in much lower altitudes. And the interesting thing is that, of course, the northern population does hibernate, but the northeastern population does not, because it lives in a tropical kind of environment where it's not necessary to hibernate through the winter. So tell me about polar bears, Annie.
Okay, so I actually love what you just said there about the choice in hibernation, or choice, I guess we'll say. We gotta remember that hibernating is something that bears do out of dire need, right? They've come up with this great adaptation to survive a foodless time or cold time, and that's the answer for them in many cases is hibernation. So if they don't need it, they're not going to do it, which I think is sometimes we don't realize that. Okay, polar bears. Ursus maritimus. Polar bears are big and they're sea bears. They are going to spend their life and earn their living from the sea. They are not terrestrial animals. Now, that's not to say they don't ever go on land, but they really are a bear of the sea. They can be about 6 to 9 feet in terms of like if they're standing up. I think I would even put 9 feet. I'd put them a little taller than that. Certainly they seem that way when we're watching them in Churchill. The females and the males, big difference in size, just like you talked about, that sexual dimorphism is through and through. So much so that you can sometimes have a female mom with a male cub, and because she's going to hang on to them for a couple years, you could accidentally think the cub is mom if you were only judging by size, because they can be, you know, that much bigger. Gestation is interesting. The reason I say around 8 months is that there is some variability in that, and that's going to depend on how much weight she gains. The mom has to gain a certain amount of weight, and all of these bears that we're talking about, they do have delayed implantation. And so, well, the time period that from when she mates to when she gives birth can be many, many months. The actual gestation period is more like 60 days. It's a short time period. So that's an interesting kind of thing there, where when it actually kind of locks into the uterine wall, and that also probably could be its own webinar. Now, the lifespan, it's a tough world out there in the wild for polar bears. And certainly we'll talk a little bit later about behavior, but you know, if they get their jaw broken or lose teeth, that's going to be the beginning of the end. And that is why when they are in captivity, they can live so much longer, because of the dentist. Essentially, great dental care can have a lot to do with the lifespan of an animal. So brush your teeth, because it can work for us too. Now, in terms of their population, we're looking at between 22 and 31,000 worldwide. There's a reason that that number is so big, because there are a lot of places where we know there's polar bear populations, but there's data deficient in that area. We just don't really know exactly how many are there. So these are polar bears from Alaska. We've got here in Alaska brown bears, black bears, and polar bears. So some commonality there with what's going on in India. And when we look at where polar bears live, please forgive the blurriness of this, but pay attention to the colors. How we define the Arctic, in my opinion, actually should just be defined by where polar bears live. We can look at things like an isotherm, which is an average temperature being what it should be, but Churchill gets really warm in the summer, and so that kind of throws that off. We can look at the Arctic Circle as defining the Arctic. We can look at tree line, but really, if you just look at where polar bears live, you end up having a fantastic definition of the Arctic. So I like to go with this one. This shows us the different populations. There's 19 different populations of polar bears around the world. And of those, the one that we spend quite a bit of time seeing is the Western Hudson Bay bears. So right down here, it's kind of hard to see where Churchill is on this map, but this would be the Western Hudson Bay population. And then the bears that we just looked at in that picture, when I said they're from Alaska, they're from this population. So this map is a great way for us to understand, you know, if we want to count how many polar bears there are in the world, some of these populations, we just don't have the numbers. So we don't know how many bears are in the East Greenland population or in the Kara Sea, but we do know that they're there. Tell me about where the sloth bears live.
Yeah, Annie, before I talk about that, I have a question about the polar bear populations.
Sure.
I mean, looking at the map and knowing that the Arctic is mostly uninhabited, is it correct to presume that all polar bear populations are connected to each other genetically, or are there any barriers of fragmentation of any sort that separate them?
That's a great question. And we do know that the males tend to be the likely ones to wander, if you will, out of their specific population. And that is one of the things that has helped the overall population stay genetically healthy. Females will tend to have, this is a hard one, they'll have what we call denning site fidelity, meaning they'll go back to the same denning area. But as sea ice melts, that becomes a big question mark for some of the bears who maybe had an area that they would go den in that is now not solid. It's not something they can count on. Still, females are going to stay pretty local to their area. Males are the ones who are likely to help with that genetic diversity.
Interesting. Okay.
All right. Tell me about these sloth bears.
Sloth bears. So this is a more or less up-to-date map of sloth bear range across the Indian subcontinent. Of course, it was a lot larger, not very far back in history. So sloth bears are found more or less corresponding with a lot of tiger range, or at least tiger habitat. A lot of those areas might not have tigers anymore, but sloth bears tend to persist for much longer than say other large carnivores, and even after a lot of other herbivores have been wiped out of an area. So central India and eastern India have probably the largest population of sloth bears, and down south in the Western Ghats and in the Deccan area that I spoke about, there are also very large sloth bear populations. They tend to occur very close to human habitation as well, compared to, say, the bigger cats. Sri Lanka, of course, has a very steady sloth bear population, which is quite visible in places like the Yala National Park, where we travel to on our Sri Lanka trip. And we also have sloth bears across along the foothills of the Himalaya in what we call the Terai region, where their range spans across India and Nepal, further up north. Yeah, right there. And as you head towards northeast India, the sloth bear distribution sort of abruptly ends. There are areas where sloth bears do have some overlap with the Himalayan black bear, but that's about the only bear they have only other bear they have any overlap with.
That's interesting. This whole idea of which bears come in contact with other bears and then how they do. We're going to talk a little bit more about that later. Tell us, what are the threats that are facing the sloth bears? What's hard for them these days?
Well, in order of the degree of threat, I'd put habitat loss at number one. As India develops, not only are we losing a lot of forested habitat, which is considered prime habitat for these animals, even the rocky, bouldery outcrops like the hills of the Deccan Plateau are under threat, because a lot of these areas are getting dynamited for quarrying, and that is one of the greatest threats to the sloth bear. And there's also a lot of conflict with people in places like say areas that grow sugarcane, for example, close to sloth bear habitat. Sugarcane is a great draw for sloth bears. They love the sweet cane, and the sugarcane crop is it's an impenetrable thick grassland kind of habitat for sloth bears, tigers, leopards as well. So that causes a lot of very unpleasant interactions between people and sloth bears, because and again, I'll talk about this later again, but sloth bears tend to have very poor hearing and eyesight, and offense is their best defense. And when people surprise a bear in, say, a crop of sugarcane or out in the forest, they're very likely to get attacked. And in some parts of India, not everywhere, bears do get killed in snares or with country-made bombs that are hidden inside baits and things like that. There is some amount of poaching for the illegal trade in bear parts. There is a market in Far East Asian countries for things like bear bile, but I would certainly not put it at the same scale as, say, the poaching for tiger skins or leopard skins. There's something interesting that used to be a threat to sloth bears until fairly recently, which, thanks to the efforts of a lot of dedicated conservationists, is now history. There used to be a tradition of bear dancing in places like Agra, where tame sloth bears, which were smuggled as cubs, used to be trained to dance to a tune, and that used to be a sort of tourist attraction. And fortunately, that practice has now been totally ended, and there are rescue centers where those bears have been rehabilitated. But until, say, about 4 or 5 years ago, the smuggling of sloth bears for sloth bear cubs for this purpose was a major threat to sloth bears.
Certainly, we've seen that cultural shift with circus bears here in the States as well, right? That it used to be a thing. So let's switch gears here and we'll talk about the threats that are facing polar bears. I think, unfortunately, this is something that the two bears do have in common. When we look at polar bears, of course, climate change and the loss of sea ice is the #1 threat to the polar bear populations. Now, what's interesting about polar bears is they are set aside as vulnerable, and that determination is based on their loss of habitat. Most animals, when we decide whether or not they're going to be vulnerable or if there's plenty of them, those kind of distinctions, we look at the number of the animals and not just their habitat. But with polar bears, we realize that their habitat is so critically threatened that it will therefore affect their numbers. We also have industrial impacts. So we have, especially with the ice melting, we have more boats moving through. We've got pollutants from mining, from oil, and also an interesting one that we're learning about, this kind of newer information, is that polar bears are incredible at hearing. You know, we often talk about animals having like, well, what's their superpower, right? Maybe it's that you've got all different things for different animals, right? For polar bears, we often talk about it being their nose, because their olfactory abilities are phenomenal. However, it turns out that their hearing is also phenomenal. So as the Arctic opens up, something that does need to be paid attention to is, are the noises that are entering this region going to affect polar bear behavior? And then, of course, there's the human conflict. Just, Churchill manages this beautifully. I can't wait, Aditya, for you to get to come to Churchill someday and you'll see this, the famous polar bear alert program. Other places where polar bears interact with humans look to Churchill as a leader in how is it that we can live in a place where polar bears are moving through. I was just on a friend's Facebook page the other day. She lives in Churchill, Rhonda Reed, who many of our guests have met. And sure enough, she had a photo of a polar bear just walking right through town in the middle of the day. So it's good to remember that, we do have to interact with these bears, and having a plan for how to do that is critically important. So we're going to shift gears now. We've set up that we know a little bit about the evolution of these bears. We know a little bit about sloth bears now and a little bit about polar bears and where they live and what they're facing in the world. we're going to almost play a game here. We're going to naturalist ask some questions about these animals. And we're especially going to focus on the polar bear because someday I need to make sure Aditya can see a polar bear. So let's look at the polar bears here and go for it. Ask away, my friend.
That's something I've really been looking forward to, considering that my closest physical interaction with the polar bear so far has been as a 6-year-old with a little toy polar bear that I used to have, which I'd love to half submerge in a bowl of water, which I'd then put in the freezer, and that gave me a kick.
You're a naturalist in the making, even from a young age, huh?
So yeah, Annie, what's this polar bear got in its mouth here?
Okay,
That
so
doesn't look...
it's not a seal, that's for sure. So this is something that we see in Churchill quite a bit. This is kelp. The bear is simply chewing on the kelp. It does seem like they eat it. It probably isn't going to offer really much nutritional benefits, but it does seem, I mean, I shouldn't say that. It offers nutritional benefits, but not enough calories to make a difference. The benefits are probably that there's enzymes in the kelp, minerals that are going to help with metabolism and maybe get their juices flowing. They've gone a long period of time when we see them in Churchill without food. And so this is sort of just maybe it's like the mint that they're going to have with a, with a meal. It's just going to kind of keep things going. So we do see them chewing on this. We'll also see this sort of omnivore behavior from polar bears with berries. They certainly like to eat the, blueberries that are often growing in the far north. And so we'll see them sometimes have some bluish and purplish colors on them in the early fall, probably when they have gotten a taste of that. But in general, they don't eat very many plants, and it's all about the fat and the seal meat. So
yeah,
what about this? Let's talk about the difference in habitat.
Yeah. Well, the sloth bear habitat looks nothing like this. It's mostly tropical forest, either moist deciduous or dry deciduous, or in some places evergreen forest, and also a lot of scrub forest and rocky outcrops. So what's polar bear habitat like?
Well, it's interesting. They are critically dependent on ice, and not just any kind of ice. And I think that's probably one of the biggest mistakes or just sort of stereotypes. It's like if they have ice, they're good, but they have to have what we call annual ice, because that's going to be thin enough where, first of all, the whole food chain is going crazy underneath there. We are looking at a jungle, but the jungle is below the ice. So there's a lot of phytoplankton happening and zooplankton, everything that is needed for a healthy food chain. If it's multi-year ice, the sun can't get through it in order for that whole food chain to happen down below. And a polar bear a seal can't come up and breathe through, ice that's meters and meters and meters thick. And the polar bear can't hunt through it. So that multi-year ice that's in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, that's not where we see polar bears hanging out, and that's not where they're going to have a platform to eat what they need to eat. Now, Churchill is a bit of a it's an early bird in a sense that the bears that we see in Churchill have this pattern and have for thousands of years of coming onto land when the Hudson Bay melts. Typically, the oceans that are, say, north of Alaska, the Arctic Ocean, that didn't used to melt during the summer. But those bears are now needing to learn from their friends over in Hudson Bay to figure out how to be on land for part of the year. The rings. Yeah.
Sorry, no, I was saying that it's amazing how delicate these cycles of annual ice and things like that are, things that do not probably occur to people who haven't had much interaction with these places or these animals, and how easily these could get totally devastated by climate change, these cycles which keep these species alive.
Yeah, That's excellent point. I think you're right on in terms of like, we think it's just going to be there forever. It's not, and we need to take care of it. And this ring seal is one of the reasons, because like I said, the polar bear needs that annual ice in order to go after its main food source, and that is the ring seal. They're prolific. There's millions of them around the Arctic. If you look at where polar bears are around the Arctic and their distribution, you're basically looking at the ring seal distribution. So this is definitely their main food source. They need about a seal a week throughout the year in order to have enough fat gain. Now that's not all going to happen. It's not like every Monday they go out and get their seal. And some weeks, hopefully they're going to get more, and then other weeks less. So that's the food. Now let's talk about the adaptations. What are your questions on this one, Aditya?
Well, imagining that you know, the polar bear is so much bigger than the sloth bear, I thought that the claws would be a lot longer than what I see here. And also, you know, when you see sloth bears, despite the fact that they live in the middle of Indian summer heat, they're so shaggy, they have such long hair. Polar bears look a lot better groomed to me.
Well, so one thing is they do have to keep their coat clean in order for it to keep its insulative properties. So that's part of why they are so well groomed. Those big paws that you see, they are about the size of a dinner plate. So the next time you're going to have a meal and you've got your 12-inch dinner plate out, just put your hand over that plate without the food on it, of course, and look at the difference in the size. There was one time when I was outside of polar bear season. I met my husband in Churchill, and we were out for a skidoo ride looking for polar bear prints for a film crew. I wasn't sure if I wanted to find them or not. I mean, I did for the film crew, but I was like, wait, if we find prints, it means we're close to a bear, and we're just on a snow machine here. Well, we did find them, and I did put my hand next to the print, and it's humbling. I'll say that much. It's incredibly humbling. And honestly, I just wanted to get back on that snow machine and get back to the safety of the lodge that we were at. So as far as those claws go, you bring up a really good point. Long claws would be a detriment on the ice. So they're a little longer, I think, than they appear here, but they're certainly really, really strong, and something that's not going to, you know, crack off easily. You know how a dog's claws, if they get too long, they'll crack in a dangerous way for the animal. So I think that's why we see these sort of robust, strong claws here. Another thing that's really cool when we think about why they have to have such big footprints, it's to disperse their weight over the ice. So because of the way their weight is dispersed on those huge prints, a polar bear, much heavier than me, even after the pandemic, would be able to stand on thinner ice than I would be able to stand on. So, and that's because the weight is dispersed. Super cool. What are you said are the claws of the sloth bear? They look quite long.
They are very long, in fact. So, you know, there are two stories behind why sloth bears are called sloth bears. One, of course, is that, you know, early British explorers probably saw them hanging upside down from tree branches like sloths would, and they called it the bear sloth. Another story is that the claws of the sloth bear reminded them of the claws of a sloth, which are also very long. But a sloth bear does need these very long claws because it primarily eats on, you know, it feeds on termites a lot, and it needs those claws to dig into those big termite mounds that can be several feet high and equally deep. So, so yeah, besides the claws, there are two other adaptations that the sloth bear has for this particular kind of diet that it has. One, of course, is the protruding lip, And the nostrils, if you notice, are designed to absolutely shut down when the sloth bear is sucking out termites, because the last place you'd want to have termites on you is inside your nostrils. And sloth bears are excellent climbers. They climb up trees to raid beehives, and those claws are very useful there as well. And the long coat, the very thick, dense, long coat protects them from the bee stings and termite bites. So that's why they have such long hair despite living in such a hot part of the world. So those are the primary adaptations that sloth bears have. And on this animal here, you can probably make out that their eyesight isn't all that great. It isn't very well developed, nor is their hearing. But Annie, if you have a sloth bear somewhere close to your, within 300 feet of your safari jeep, sucking on termites, you can still hear it. They're very noisy feeders. But when I say they feed on termites, of course, they don't solely feed on termites. They're omnivores like every other bear. So they feed on a variety of berries and plants as well. And in summer, for example, which is when most of the trees in the deciduous forests of India come into fruit, there is you find a lot of fruit content in their scat, and they also love this very beautiful flower and fruit that we have that again grows in the summer, in spring and summer, called the mahua, which is very rich in sugar. And the mahua fruit sort of gets deposited under the tree all night, and it ferments overnight. And it's not uncommon to see sloth bears absolutely drunk out of their heads, dozing under a mahua tree, sometimes in the summer.
Wow, that sounds like a super interesting behavior to witness. And I can hear as you're describing these bears, things that we definitely saw from Baloo in the Jungle Book. That's for sure. Climbing the trees to get to the bees, and certainly some silly behavior, whether it's from those fermented fruits or not. Let's talk a little bit about behavior. What questions do you have about polar bear behavior?
Well, I have seen a lot of pictures and videos of polar bears, multiple polar bears in the same area. Are they social animals?
That is a great question. So we both have seen that a group of bears could be called a sloth or a sleuth of bears. I've heard people pronounce it both ways. Most bear people I know don't really love that. I'm going to agree with the writer Sherry Simpson, who wrote Dominion of Bears, and she said that a group of bears should be called a story. And I think that that is a far better description, because anytime you see bears together, there's a story that's going to go along with that. So when we see the polar bears on the shores of Hudson Bay, they're all kind of stuck in this waiting room together, and they're having to figure each other out. So there's a lot of, as the tundra turns, kind of drama that plays out as these bears are forced to interact with each other. Whether it's these guys right here, they're figuring out how to get their fitness going before they head out onto the ice, right? They're figuring out who's who here. So if this bear that is clearly shorter is going to meet this other bear out on the ice, most likely the taller bear won. Now, if that's true, sometimes shorter bears are more aggressive and they might win, if you will. They could save a lot of energy when there actually is food to fight over or a female to fight over. They will say, okay, wait, I remember you from that waiting area in Churchill, and you kind of kicked my butt. So I'm just going to go the other way now and leave you with that seal or that whale carcass. When we see brown bears, in Alaska. They're gathering in a similar area because that's where the salmon is located. And they're going to put up with each other being there because there's plenty of food. So it's the place to be. It's like being at the best restaurant in town. You're likely to run into your friends. This is where we see groups of polar bears or of brown bears. Also, an opening in the ice during the winter months is a place where you might see several polar bears together because it's a chance to get at some food. What about sloth bears? Are we going to see sloth bears in groups? Are we going to see a story of sloth bears?
Well, the only time you'd see a story of sloth bears is probably when mother is around with grown-up cubs. But otherwise, they're quite solitary, and you usually see them alone. And yeah, that's usually how they are when you see them while out on safari, running away, trying to hide. But you know, sometimes, as you will see in the next slide, they might not be in the mood to run away. Now, these were this wasn't on safari. This is, you know, on safari you wouldn't be out at night using a spotlight like this. This was while I was out on other work somewhere else, when I came across a story of bears, mother and two grown-up cubs. And these two were the cubs. And, you know, when we stopped to watch them, mother was quite sure that, you know, this is a jeep and it doesn't mean us any harm. And she was walking away. But these two decided to, you know, charge the jeep. And, you know, sloth bears believe in shooting first and asking later. And as we were discussing earlier today, that's one of the reasons why so many people get terribly scarred and injured and occasionally killed by sloth bears, because imagine if you're a farmer going out at the crack of dawn into your fields and it's foggy and it's winter, you might not be able to see a bear until you're right upon it, and with its poor hearing and poor eyesight, it might not be able to see you. So it you know, immediately attacks. And when we are out on foot in India's forests, you know, tigers are the last thing on our minds, you know, when it comes to being terrified. There are two things that we are terrified of when we are out on foot in the Indian forest. Number one is the lone bull elephant, and the other is the sloth bear, because that's one animal we never want to meet on foot.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like it's a good idea at all. Now, we are getting close to the top of the hour here, and we definitely want to leave a little bit of room for questions. So we're going to go through the reproduction and the gestation pretty quickly here so that we can wrap up and answer some questions. The key thing to know about polar bears is that there's a few things. One, fierce mamas, that's a bit of a stereotype. Some of them are, and some of them might not be. When you have these incredibly intelligent animals, you're going to see some variation in whether or not they're super protective, really great at hunting, easily distracted. This kind of variability will happen. Typically, they're going to keep their cubs for 2 summers, 2 winters, and maybe even a little bit longer. That's an adjustment we're seeing of the Churchill bears to having less food. They're keeping their cubs for longer, and that's a quick adaptation, which is pretty cool. I think we're going to have to do a whole webinar on polar bear reproduction and all the delayed implantation stuff, but I will say this, I don't think there's a greater joy in life than watching a mama bear with her cubs. It is absolutely one of my favorite things. Until we talk about whales, then I'm probably going to say the same thing. What about with the sloth bears? Really quick so we can leave room for questions. Is there anything really important for us to know about them?
Well, one thing is, of course, as you see on your screen, the sloth bear is probably the only bear that carries its cubs on its back. You know, they usually have between 1 and 3 cubs, you know, typically 2, very rarely 3. But I don't think any other bear carries its cubs like this on the back. And like with the polar bears, sloth bear cubs also stay with their mothers for about 2 years.
Very, very cool. All right, guys. So we've tried to share some fun information with you on sloth bears, polar bears. We hope that you get to come up and see polar bears or sloth bears with us, for that matter. And Colby, at this point, we're happy to turn it over for questions. I know we only left a little bit of time, but do we have any burning questions out there?
Well, we do, of course, and I'd like to remind the viewers that they're welcome to submit their own questions via the Q&A field in their GoToWebinar control panel. Some folks have been doing that all along. How about if we start with a question? You can each answer this question, so it's a good one about reproduction. So with bears, we'll stick to the sloth bear and the polar bear. How about for this, for timing? And can they have 2 generations of cubs at the same time? So can they have a cub the next year, have another cub, and then raise them at different years? Aditya, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, it's very unlikely. I've seen on one occasion, just one occasion, I've seen 2 generations of tiger cubs with the mother. But with bears, I think, they don't need to hang on to mom for that long, especially sloth bears, because they don't do much hunting. And, they can fend for themselves quite early in life. I've seen, in one case, I've seen orphaned sloth bear cubs, 2 brothers, who managed to do quite well for themselves despite their mother having died, before they were fully adult. How's it with polar bears, Annie?
Well, I would say no, they don't have 2 generations at once. However, there is many stories from photographers and documented evidence from brown bears of a mom adopting a cub. There was a brown bear at Brooks that the mom adopted a cub that had gotten separated. So, and then the next season had a cub of her own. So she's got a first-year cub with a cub of the year. We use the term coy. And she's raising them together. And in that case, she ended up giving the orphan, the adoptee, longer to be reared and raised by her because she kicked them both out at the same time. So there's evidence of adopting, but when it comes to the reproducing and having them, no. Like many other mammals, mom's gonna say, wait, I gotta focus here. And the weight gaining is an issue as well. They need to gain enough weight to energetically support the next generation.
Okay, very good. How about some sloth bear questions for you, Aditya? Maybe we could just run through a couple of these in an efficient manner for everybody. We'll get as many questions as we can. Do tigers hunt bears where their ranges overlap?
Very good question. They do try to, and some tigers do succeed. I know of one case from an area where natural prey had been completely depleted and the local tiger population was on the brink of extinction. And one of the last remaining tigers was feeding almost entirely on a diet of sloth bears because they were the most commonly available large mammal there. But in other areas, in normal areas, you will have cases where dominating male tigers will try and mess around with sloth bears. Sometimes they do manage to kill them, but I've seen at least on one occasion mother bear scaring the tiger away, after it tried to mess with her.
Yeah, that's not the answer I expected. That's really interesting. Okay, Annie, let's do a polar bear one. Some folks, when you had the image up of the polar bear all stretched out walking, it looks like the back legs were very, very long. Is that true? And are their back legs different than other bears in any way?
I don't have the sort of comparative anatomy technical inches that the legs would be relative to the body. I will say it looks like it for sure, but I do believe that that's more a matter of how it looks. Now, I'm going to say that, and then with that said, The way that a polar bear is often, when they're swimming using those back legs, they're going to use their front legs like paddles essentially, and their back legs are going to be like rudders. They're going to steer. So that would be one reason that I think we can see this sort of elongated body that almost looks more like a marine mammal than it does like a bear. I'm gonna give an educated guess here, to be really honest with you all. I'm gonna be looking this up later, so thank you to whoever asked the question. I want to look up whether or not we've got some technical differences in the exact inches of the leg ratio to, say, the spine or something like that. My educated guess is it just looks that way. Colby, you guide polar bear trips. Do you have a different answer on that one?
I was thinking about that too, Annie. I can't say for sure in comparison to the brown bear. To the other bears, they do have proportionately larger legs, and remember that they're longer legs, and they're starting way up. Like what everybody sees, you know, along the back of the shoulders, like you could think of the hip, like the top of their legs is basically the top of their back, so they are extremely long. When we watch polar bears walk, it looks like they're just lumbering around, but boy, do they ever cover some distance thanks to their size and that great difference. But I'd have to look that up too, Annie. I don't know relative to the brown bears if they're appreciably longer.
I will tell you this. I will look it up, and on my next Thursday webinar, I will answer this question.
Okay, there you go.
That's a good one.
All right, Addie, back to you. The sloth bears, they have such heavy, long, furry coats. How do they handle the heat of the Indian summers?
That's an excellent question. I've often wondered about it myself. They do molt. I've seen sloth bear in slightly shorter coat, but that was in October, which doesn't make any sense. I think like with some breeds of dogs, sloth bears have a long top coat, but they probably don't have a thick undercoat that provides insulation. So the top coat protects the skin from the sun and from bees and biting insects, but there is still plenty of ventilation down there right above the skin to keep it cool.
Okay, thank you. Annie, over to you. We had a question about the Pizzly bears. Maybe you could just remind everybody quickly what a Pizzly bear is, and then is there a place that people can see Pizzly bears?
And the name is just embarrassing, isn't it? It's a mix of a grizzly and a polar bear. I've also heard other terms to describe this. It's an oddity, right? It's not the norm. I would have to look it up to see if there are zoos that you can see this in, because I think that's the one other place outside of the specific family group that I was talking about in northern Canada. I believe near Baffin Island is where that is. I don't think there's a place that you can go reliably, certainly in nature, like out in the natural habitat of these animals. I don't think there's a place that you can go count on seeing them. Unfortunately, hunters have made a great deal of effort to do that, because for a while it was sort of this prized, thing. And even they had an incredibly difficult time. So I don't think that, but I do think a quick Google search could let you know if there's any zoos that do have this.
Yeah, it's so few and far between where their ranges overlap, and then they happen to mate, and then you happen to find them. That's a tricky situation. Yeah. It's great for yourself. Aditya, you showed some pictures of the Indian bears, and a lot of them had white patches on them. We don't see that. Is that just those bears in the pictures, or is that very typical? And then I'll throw this related question. What is a moon bear?
Sure. So that is very typical of the sloth bear. It is also seen in the sun bear, where it forms in some animals it forms a complete circle, but in the sloth bear it's just a crescent. And in the Himalayan black bear, again it forms a full circle, which is why it's sometimes called the moon bear. Now, I just read this somewhere that in some grizzly bears, when they're in molting, you can make out in some individuals, light-colored individuals, you can see a very vague sort of crescent when they're in a state of molting, which again vanishes when the thicker winter coat comes up. So I think that's a characteristic that's present across several species of bears.
Okay, fascinating. That was a great question and a great answer. Thank you. Well, that is the last question we have time for today. With that, I'd like to hand it back to the two of you for closing comments. Aditya, shall we begin with you?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This was a very interesting webinar and not a very typical subject. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope all your questions were answered. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.
All right. And thank you so much to all of you who tuned in. As you know, we love talking about bears. So it's super fun that you join us each day to learn about the incredible planet that we live on. Thank you, Colby, for helping us to keep these going and to make it happen. And I can't wait to see you guys next Thursday. Aditya, thanks for joining me. So much fun.
Amazing topic.
Yeah, it was great fun. I'll share with the two of you that I've received a lot of comments how much people appreciate these comparisons and that it's really helped them understand not only the differences in these animals, but why those differences exist. So there's a number of comments there. So thank you from everybody for that. Thanks to all our viewers today for participating. We always appreciate it. We have one more for you this week tomorrow. Please join us. You can check out the rest of this week's lineup, including registration links on our website at nathab.com/webinars. We did record today's presentation today, and as always, we'll have the replay available on our website shortly. And with that, I will conclude today's webinar. Thank you, everyone.